All righty. All right. So good afternoon. Wow. Definitely a pleasure to be with you today, and welcome to the 2022 Virtual African American Caregivers Forum. My name is Michael Bailey, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the Deputy Director of the Seattle Human Services Department. But today, on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, I have the privilege of serving as your MC. The Seattle Human Services Department is committed to improving accessibility. In pursuit of that increased accessibility, we are providing closed captions in English. To turn on those captions, click on the CC Show Captions button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you need a different language, click on the little upward-facing arrow next to the CC Show Captions, and you will see a few other options. Before continuing our program, I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who have stewarded this land for many, many generations. We come with respect for this land and recognize the Duwamish people's long-standing presence throughout this territory. We honor with love and gratitude the land itself and the strength and resilience of the Duwamish people. Now, please join me in singing the first verse of the Black National Anthem. And I will pause here and allow the song to play.
Lift every voice and sing till life and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Is won. Is won.
Outstanding. And we will transition back to our presentation here.
Full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought.
And we've got some beautiful background music here. All right. Okay, so we have an exciting and fun-filled agenda for today. We have a couple of welcoming remarks to get through. Our keynote address by Dr. Croff will focus on Black joy and why that's so important for good health. We'll take a short break to share a few caregiver resources before moving to our panelists. And our panelists will share some exciting but important stories from their caregiving journeys. Last but certainly not least, we'll have a presentation by Pastor Catherine Cordova. During the pastor's presentation, she'll talk about hospice, and she'll also share her perspective on aging and end of life that focuses on living. Everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions. If all goes well, we plan to wrap up by 2 p.m. And as we go through today's presentation, we invite you to stand up and stretch as needed. That's actually one of the beauties of being virtual in this space, the additional flexibility and just the additional convenience. Alrighty, as we transition into our program, I would like to introduce Mary Mitchell. Mary Mitchell also works at the Seattle Human Services Department and serves as the Director of the Division of Aging and Disability Services. Under Mary's leadership, the division serves as the Area Agency on Aging, or AAA, not just for Seattle, but for King County. As a reminder, Mary was previously serving in an interim capacity. I am overjoyed and incredibly excited to share that after a nationwide search for a permanent director, Mary was our top choice. And with that, the office is hers. Mary, how are you feeling today?
Thank you, Michael. I am well, and I am so excited and honored to attend the forum again this year. And it's a joy to see old friends and also people that are attending for the first time. I think you'll find this event is an awesome event. Among aging and disability services, many responsibilities, we staff the Mayor's Council on African American Elders in Age-Friendly Seattle, and we provide caregiver support services. November is National Family Caregivers Month. Recently, Mayor Bruce Harrell and the Seattle City Council proclaimed November as Family Caregiver Support Month in Seattle. They recognize family caregivers as the backbone of the long-term care system in our country. That's why it's so important to maintain caregiver health. We help caregivers so they can in turn help loved ones age in place in the home and communities they know and love, rather than moving to an expensive care environment. That said, you are a caregiver, even if your loved one does not move into an adult family home or skilled nursing facility. Caregiving for a loved one never ends. There's no more important job than caring for family, but that almost always means stress. When my grandmother, Mary Hunter, who could no longer take care of herself, when she could no longer take care of herself, she moved into the home of my aunt, her daughter, after 45 years of living on 20th and Main Street. My aunt was able to provide full-time care. Even with support from other family members, it was challenging for my aunt, but she made sure my grandmother's last days were full of love. Maintaining caregiver health is a core value and service of my agency, and I want you to know how to access our caregiver support services. There's one number to call. It's local and toll-free. We will put the number in the chat as well for you, and it's 844-348-5464. Again, that's 844-348-5464. And we will make sure to put that and our website in the chat for you. And when you call, an advocate at Community Living Connections will answer your call. All you have to say is, I'm a caregiver, and they will take it from there. Consultants, information, and resources are available to all caregivers, regardless of income, because helping you maintain quality of life means you can help your loved ones more effectively. Calls to Community Living Connections are confidential and free of charge, and most services are free of charge as well. People who live with fewer means may also be eligible for additional income, in-home services, and supports at no charge. And at this time, I want to give a shout out to today's forum sponsors, to the community members who helped plan today's forum, and to Karen Winston, a senior planner on my team, and other members of the ADS team members who are supporting this event in the background or attending in the virtual audience today. We are dedicated to health, safety, and equity for all. Now back to you, Michael.
All righty. Well, thank you, Mary. And again, congratulations. We're very excited to stand behind your leadership as you continue to serve both our caregivers and the folks that we're providing care for. We'll now hear from Dr. Benjamin Abe, who chairs the Mayor's Council on African American Elders. Dr. Abe, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning and welcome to the African American Caregivers Forum. This is my pleasure to be here for the second year in a row as chair of the Mayor's Council on African American Elders. The Mayor's Council on African American Elders is a City of Seattle commission. We advocate for a better quality of life for our elders in Seattle and King County, including caregivers, and are happy to co-sponsor today's forum. I hope everyone here today will be inspired by our program. And also I invite you to attend Mayor's Council on African American Elders meetings on the third Friday of every month, online at 2 p.m. And first, this month we are not meeting, but we'll be meeting in December, the third Friday of the month. So all are welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, and we certainly encourage folks to attend the meeting. So much amazing information shared there. So definitely plug in if you get a chance. And with that being said, thank you, Dr. Abe. Next, I'd like to recognize the forum planning team. They are Tony Crutchfield, Sina Jackson, Sharon Sobers-Outlaw, Margaret Bodie, and Karen Winston. Please join me in giving the planning team a virtual round of applause, or a live round of applause should you choose. I would also like to recognize the virtual technical support team that's providing assistance in the background today. They are Eldad Makira and Karen Winston. Thank you both so much. Now, as Mary mentioned, November is National Family Caregivers Month. We dedicate this time to uplifting caregivers as they care for our loved ones 24/7. It's also an opportunity to increase awareness and support for caregivers who face issues and challenges every day. Caregivers provide support with daily living, such as bathing and dressing. They help with ensuring our bills are attended to, and other critical functions such as shopping, providing transportation, emotional support, and helping with managing a chronic condition or disability. But caregivers also face challenges. Understanding changing behaviors, juggling family dynamics, social isolation, and sometimes just the financial pressures, and that's just to name a few. The fight to rally against the COVID-19 pandemic has leveled out, but remains with us today. And even in its current form, the pandemic has increased our caregiver responsibilities and put many caregivers at risk of extreme stress, fatigue, and burnout. And that's why we have this annual event. We want you to know that you are not alone and you will never be alone. We hope that by the end of today's program, you will feel inspired, revived, and connected with other caregivers. So please use the chat box to communicate with each other and to ask questions that you may have for any of our speakers. Transitioning slightly, this year, our keynote speaker is Dr. Raina Croft. I became aware of Dr. Croft's work earlier this year when the Seattle Human Services Aging and Disability Services Division helped to launch the SHARP Seattle, a phenomenal program that encourages walking and reminiscing among people with past or current connections to Seattle's Central District. Dr. Croft is an assistant professor of neurology at the Nia Layton Aging and Alzheimer's Disease Center at the Oregon Health and Sciences Department. My apologies. Her work focuses on creating cultural celebratory approaches to physical activity, social engagement, and reminiscence therapy for healthier aging, particularly amidst the trauma of gentrification and the implications it has for older Black adults' cognitive health and social connectedness. She has an extremely impressive educational background. Over her career, she has worked as an as an anthropologist of the African diaspora and examined the intersection of human behavior, inequality, and material culture. Her early work led her to focus on medical anthropology and how cultural and society influences are influenced by health, disease, and health benefits. Dr. Croft, I will now hand it to you. My apologies for stumbling there a little bit. I am now in possession of some coffee, so we should have a true smooth transition moving forward. But the floor is yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michael. Go enjoy your coffee. I am so honored to have been asked to speak today, and I'm also very honored to be able to hear some of the stories that our panelists will be sharing today. And so I'm going to just start sharing my screen here. Okay. And is it in presenter mode? Let's see. Can someone tell me, is that in presenter mode?
Not yet.
Oh, there we go. All right, how's that?
Perfect.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today. And what I hope is that with what I'm going to share with you today and with what our panelists will share with you today, I hope that you feel seen, because the work of caregiving is tremendous. And caregivers give and give and give, often with so little of that giving back to themselves. And this is important because self-care is so critical for healthy aging. It's important because you deserve to enjoy life and to make time for joyful activities. And it's also important because we know that caregiver health can often decline more rapidly than the people that we're caring for. And so oftentimes in health presentations, Black health is presented from very deficit-based terms, often citing how we're the lowest in this or we have the highest in this. And today what I want to focus on is Black joy. I want to focus on the fact that there are many joyful activities that we can participate in. And I'll be sharing with you some scientific studies, all with older Black participants, that have proven the benefits for healthier aging and healthier cognitive aging as well through engaging in joyful activities. So my hope today is that, or my goal, my hope is that you will go away from this presentation today feeling inspired to connect, to practice self-care, and to remember to make room for joy. So I'm going to be focusing on a number of studies, all relatively within the last 5 years. And we'll be looking at mindfulness and social connection and what happens when we engage in stimulating activities like going to see a live performance or joining a group like a choir. We'll be talking about the benefits of reminiscence, and then we'll finish up with discussing the SHARP study, which is a walking program in Portland and now in Seattle as well. So this is a study that I was engaged in. And so this was a mindfulness study. We used mindfulness to try to decrease stress, to reduce stress. And this took place in Portland, Oregon. And so we had 10 African American women aged 50 to 89, and they engaged in 4 weekly classes of mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this involves breathing techniques, It involves feeling where in your body you're experiencing stress or pain. It involves learning how to walk mindfully, or even just to drink your tea mindfully, to feel the curve of the cup and the warmth of the cup as it's filled with tea and the aroma, just really being present in the moment. And what we found was that these 4 weeks, just 4 weeks of 2 hours each week, with half of that time being a discussion about how these mindfulness classes affected people, we found that they developed better coping strategies to face some of the stresses that they had been talking about. And so this here is a table of our results. And what we found was that practicing mindfulness helped people to remember their core self, to remember, to remain in one's element. It helped them to process confrontation and stress, to minimize their reactionary responses. We found that it had a calming and empowering effect. And we also found that just stopping and being still helped people to remember their core self so they could really think about how it is that they were going to respond to these stressful situations. So as one participant said in our focus groups, they said, it helped me to think about what am I going to do differently so that I can relieve the stress so that I'm healthier, regardless of the adversarial things that come into our path, right? Because there's always going to be those stressful situations. We cannot control that part, but what we can control is how we respond to them. Though that does take training, because many of us are mired in our reactionary responses. I mean, even including myself, I'm still working on that, especially with my children. Another participant said, this has helped me to not be so concerned about whatever is happening around me and to bring me back to my center, to my core. So this was another mindfulness study. I was not involved in this one. And this was about adapting or modifying the African Ngoma healing ceremony for stress reduction. And so this study was really trying to target interrupting those reactive patterns, the way we just instantly react when we're faced with stress. That could be yelling, that could be denying the situation, however you just instinctively react, which is not always healthy and sometimes exacerbates the stressful situation and the stress that you're feeling. And so in the Ngoma healing ceremony, Go stands for strength of the panther and Ma is to give. So this healing ceremony is like restoring your inner strength, which is your panther. So what this study did was these researchers worked with 2 women from the Republic of Congo because it was very important to get the cultural aspects of this healing ceremony right. And so the Ngoma group involved 25 to 60-year-olds, about 47% were Black. And this was 8 weeks, about 2.5 hours per week. And they practiced mindful walking, gentle yoga, relaxation, mindful speaking and listening, and group dialogue. And what they found was that there was a robust decrease in depression, anxiety. They also experienced better group cohesion. So the sense of belonging in a group, which is so important to be able to stay connected and social. They had better self-reported health in all the categories that they were testing. But the most notable changes were better social well-being and social functioning. So being social is so important for how we age and for maintaining our good cognitive health. So this is a study that talks about being socially connected. This was a study that I was involved in, and this was called the iConnect study in Portland. And we worked with isolated older adults, both healthy as well as those who had mild cognitive impairment. And so mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, it often precedes Alzheimer's disease, but not always. And it just means that you have more memory loss than is normal for your age. And so what we did was we had daily 30-minute online conversations with these older adult participants. And they were having a conversation with us, with the research team, with just a one-on-one conversation over a laptop that we gave them. We made sure it was very user-friendly. So we weren't adding to anyone's stress. And we just showed various pictures, and those pictures acted as conversational prompts. And what we found was just with this 30 minutes of social interaction a day, we found that it improved language-based executive function. So that involves how we plan, how we focus, and being able to accomplish multiple tasks at the same time. And this improved for people who were healthy as well as those who had mild cognitive impairment. It also improved psychomotor speed, which is hand-eye coordination, among those who had mild cognitive impairment. So what the takeaway of being social 30 minutes a day is really that stimulating activities, even late in life, can result in less decline in brain function. Now, this is a study that I'm fascinated by. This study looked at attending live performances and what can that do for our cognitive health. So they wanted to examine if attending live performances was associated with changes in cognition. This was done in the South Side, Chicago, and they looked at attending music or theater. They looked at over 5,000 individuals, almost 4,000 of those were African Americans. The average age was 72 years old, and they asked the question, in the past 10 years, how many times have you attended a concert, a play, or a musical? And then they did follow-up interviews every 3 years. And so what we're looking at here is what they found was that for African Americans who had no attendance of live performances, okay, so what you see on the bottom here, the years, that's over 8 years, and what you see on the vertical bar that says cognitive function, I have to kind of turn my head to read that. That is they started with a cognitive level here. It's not important to know, what exactly the level means. What's important is the slope, to look at the slope of the line. So by the end of 8 years, their cognition had decreased significantly. But for those that had frequently attended theater, music, plays, live performances, they started off the same, but their cognitive decline was much slower. Just look at the difference from starting off the same to the much slower rate of decline over those 8 years. And so what they found was that frequent theater attendance was associated with slower decline in overall cognitive function, and that 10 or more performances a year was associated with 23% slower cognitive decline versus never attending. Now, I know 10 or more performances sounds like a lot, especially we're still sort of coming out of COVID and we don't want to be in large crowds. But again, the point here is engaging in stimulating activities that you enjoy. They also found that slower decline in individual tests of perceptual speed. So that's like how you can match symbols and numbers. And so that's important in reading. And also a slower decline in episodic memory. So remembering where you parked your car, remembering what you had for dinner the night before, or the friends you met up with, and slower decline on their cognitive health assessments, which is one of those assessments is called an MMSE. So this is another study I really love. So, I mean, this just looks joyful, right? Just this picture. So this study looked at exploring perceived benefits of choral singing among older adults. And so this study, it was a qualitative study and is focused, they had focus groups at PACE day centers that had an active choir, and 17 out of 19 of the participants were African American. And participants in the choir said that it's a joyful time together. I look forward to feeling good. I know that I am going to feel good when I come here and it's time for us to sing. We have a joyful time, and that is exactly what I like. This other person says, so now I am here and all of us, we have a good time together and I keep them laughing all the time. It was an uplifting experience performing for others. So there's several things here that I think are important. One is to have something to look forward to, something that is regularly scheduled. So you can say, oh yes, I've got this coming up this week. I may be having a difficult time today, I'm dealing with some stressful stuff, but if I can just hang on till I can get to my activity, and that activity, maybe you're not someone to join a choir or some other large activity. Maybe it's just saying, all right, I've got my weekly Tuesday meeting up with my friend at the coffee shop, or they're coming over to visit me. Having something to look forward to on a regular basis is so important. And that takes a little bit of planning, but it's well worth the effort. So a study in 2017 found that older adults who participated in community-based choirs reported fewer doctor's visits, fewer falls, less medication use, and better physical health over a 2-year period compared to those in the control group. So the control group are those who were just living their life as normal, but were not in a choir group. So there is something to be said for singing, for being in a group, for creating something together. Now, this study is close to my heart because I do reminiscence work, both in Portland and now with a fantastic team in Seattle, which we'll be talking about in a moment. So this focused on the power of reminiscence for relieving depression. Now, depression is very important when it comes to maintaining your cognitive health, because depression can cause memory loss, and it can also increase the rate of cognitive decline. It can result in faster progression of dementia. Also, if you think about it, when you are depressed, you tend to not be as outgoing, you tend to not want to participate, you tend to be less social, you tend to be less physically active. So it makes sense that all of this would contribute to less blood flow in our brain. There's something called vascular dementia when you don't have adequate blood flow, and to overall just less cognition if you're not practicing the stimulating art of conversation. So attachment focused means dealing with or reminiscing on relationships that weren't necessarily resolved. And so this is an important point, I think, because it shows that even reminiscing about things that may not have been pleasant in your life, but having a chance to review that and process that and think about it in a group setting with others still had beneficial effects. And so to give you an example of what some of these attachment-like questions were. So, for example, this was called a life review, and there's other phases of life in here that I didn't include. But some of these questions were, did you have a sense of belonging in your adolescence? Or do you remember feeling left alone, abandoned, or not having enough love or care as a child or adolescent? So not necessarily just reminiscing about the joyful times. I mean, we all know that life is not all joy, and that when we do have joy, that is like a rare jewel that we need to cling to, and that if there is something we enjoy, that we need to absolutely make time for it. So I think this is so important because the SHARP study that I'll be talking to you about in a moment here, that has to do with older Black adults walking in the CD, walking in the gentrifying neighborhoods of Portland, and looking at a neighborhood that is lost. I don't want to say lost, a neighborhood that has drastically changed, affecting the community, affecting the sense of belonging. That can be very depressing. Yet at the same time, I'll be sharing with you some of the positive benefits of still doing that reminiscence. But back to this study. So this 8-week life review of reminiscence intervention with healthy older African Americans, it had consistently high attendance, 95% retention rate, and it had significant decline in depression. Now, this 95% is really important because so often in health interventions, people drop out, especially if these are like multiple weeks. So the fact that this retained people's interest and they kept engaging in the study till the end probably contributed to a greater impact on reducing their depression. So the longer you stay in doing healthy activities, the better health outcomes that you can experience. So let's talk about moving our bodies. And I'm not talking going to the gym and lifting weights necessarily, or running a marathon. I'm just talking about daily step counts, just keeping your body moving throughout the day. So this study was done with 82 African Americans in Baltimore. They had no dementia, and the average age was about 67. And they wore a step activity monitor for 3 to 7 days. And what they found was that more daily walking, even low intensity walking, which is around 0 to 100 steps per minute, they had larger hippocampal volume. Okay, so that's a part in the brain, larger hippocampal volume in older Black women. And the hippocampus is critical for learning and memory, right? And we know that's really important as we age. We want to remember people's names. We want to remember things that we just learned so that we can do that same task the next day, right? So learning and memory, this had a significant effect on the actual size of the hippocampus in their brain. When you look at brains of individuals who have Alzheimer's disease, we see a shrinkage, right? There's a shrinkage in the actual brain tissue. So being able to sustain the size and volume of the brain is really important because we know the shrinkage has a great deal to do. It's one of the signs of having advanced Alzheimer's disease. So this study by one of my mentors, Lisa Barn in Chicago, this study said that total physical activity and daytime movement, including both exercise and non-exercise, okay, so just cooking or doing some light cleaning around the house, or I don't know if you like to dance in your chair, but you know, I'm not talking about the regular, what you might think of as going out on a walk specifically for exercise, just regular stuff you do around the house. So both exercise and non-exercise physical activity, as well as total energy expenditure, was associated with better cognitive function and lower odds of cognitive impairment and reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. So however you've got to move your body, just move it. All right, so this is near and dear to me. This is the SHARP study. So I direct this study. I have the immense privilege of having had the opportunity to expand this to Seattle and work with a phenomenal group there, including emerging young Black scholars. So what the SHARP study is it stands for Sharing History Through Active Reminiscence and Photo Imagery, or SHARP, which is much easier. And the aim of this walking study is to maintain or improve older Black adults' brain health through celebrating culture and actively producing it. So when I say actively producing culture, what we're doing is we are telling our stories based on historical image prompts of the gentrifying neighborhood. We're telling our story, and those oral histories are being recorded, and that is producing culture, because that will be a testimony to our culture, how life was, how we feel now, how older adults feel now in these changing neighborhoods. All of that is part of contributing to the production of culture that other people will be able to learn from and enjoy in the future. And so this study, funded by the Alzheimer's Association and the CDC and the National Institute on Aging in Portland, and by Seattle Neighborhoods in Seattle. And so what we did was we developed an app. This is the SHARP walking app, and there are 72 walking routes. So people walk in groups of threes, 2 people who are healthy paired with 1 person who has mild cognitive impairment. And they walk for 3 times a week. In Seattle, it was 3 times a week for 1 month. And in Portland, it was 3 times a week for 6 months. And so 3 points along the route, there are these historical neighborhood images that pop up. And they're accessing this on one group tablet. And there's a pre-programmed route that they follow. And there's these 3 images that pop up to sustain and, well, to start and sustain a conversation. So that's the device that they use. And they're in groups of 3. And the goal at the end, well, besides, you know, better brain health and just being socially connected, is we're going to create this oral history digital archive. So we had 27 different walk themes. Here's an example of one of our walks, or one of our conversation prompts. And this goes right past the Delta Sigma Theta house. So they're literally passing the space, and they're reflecting on what used to be. And this says, were you ever in any plays? What role did theater play in Portland's Black community? So there's just a variety of different topics that people can talk about. Now, these are some pictures that we use in our Seattle walks. So the Seattle participants, they completed 12 walks. And so this particular route was called Building Community. And we looked at the members of the Royal Esquire Club on the steps of Collins Field House. And we asked, were you ever a part of any social clubs? Another example of a memory marker, oh, I didn't mention, we call these memory markers. So this one was looking at the Mardi Gras parade. Did you ever participate in or attend the Mardi Gras parade? So it's just really fascinating to see how people, how they spark each other's memories, because sometimes there's holes in our memory, but when we're with a friend, they can sort of fill that in. And then you get this really beautiful 360 picture of what went on in that space, or what other people remember about their family being involved in that space. So did this have an effect on brain health? Well, for the Portland study, 18 of our 21 individuals remained. Again, it's a joyful experience. It's something that is near and dear to the community. So we had high retention rate. And we did find that we had improvement in all of the areas you see on the right side of your screen, in all of these various areas. Better blood pressure, more people were reporting themselves to be in excellent or good health. More people had more days in the past 4 weeks feeling calm and peaceful. And we had statistically significant change in cognitive score, particularly for those who had MCI. So what you're looking at here is the total where it says 50. Half of our participants had improved cognitive score. So we did an assessment at baseline, the very beginning of the walks, and at the end of 6 months. And we found that people with mild cognitive impairment, 63% of our sample, so that's actually only 5 individuals, but they had improved scores, and the amount that their score improved was 3.6 points, which is statistically significant. And what that means is that it's not just left up to chance, but statistically significant means that it is because of the intervention that that improvement was observed. Oh, here's my little circles, so you know what you're looking at. And what about mood? I'm wrapping up here, but I want to focus in on mood for a second. We had mentioned that these walks, like the other reminiscence study, talking about things that are difficult in the past, or going through and looking at a neighborhood that isn't as it used to be, and maybe you feel like you don't belong as much. Like, think about how much the CD has changed, right? But still, people reported having better mood, both right after group walks and since group walks began. In fact, 100% of our sample reported having better mood. And that is so important because, you know, depression and loneliness is linked to worse cognitive health outcomes or poor aging. And so this person says, now it's like you don't got time for the TV. You got to get somewhere. And then you've got to be there on time. And you've got to participate, and you have to do the walk. After you do the walk, it's been rewarding to know that other people my age are active. Again, it's having that regular weekly meeting to look forward to. This person says, now this is interesting because this picture here, we actually, you see the 2 women, we actually had the daughters of those 2 women walking together, and I didn't even know it. And they looked at the picture and said, those are our moms. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And they said, or one person said, the remembrance is so important. You know, they're reflecting on the sharp walks. And I think that pushes back the Alzheimer's when people forget. Well, they have a name right on the tip of their tongue, and somebody says, well, that's such and such. Oh, and then that kicks in a whole bunch of other memories. And I think that's insightful. That's good. Just walking together brings all those memories back, and names that you have forgotten, hadn't heard for 15 or 20 years or longer. Brings back, and that's joyful. And this is our last quote. Participants said, it's a happy learning experience walking together. And they're sharing it with me within this walk in the actual area that it happened. And I'm even here thinking, wow, I've now become more connected with this community than I ever had before. So I hope that you've been able to take away some ideas for how you can engage in joyful activities, and how important it is to do so for your own self-care and your own better healthy aging. So a recap, practice some mindfulness. It doesn't have to be meditation. It can just be really focusing in on that cup of coffee or that cup of tea you have, and let it bring back your inner panther, right? Your inner strength to be able to really face those stressors and control how you respond to those stressors. Stay social at least 30 minutes a day. Engage in stimulating activities and new things. If you can afford to go to lots of live performances, that's great. If you can't, it's other stimulating activities. That's the main point. Join an activity group, or just meet a friend and have a regular meeting time. Take time to reminisce with others, and get out and walk, especially with others, because then you're getting your social connection in at the same time. And most of all, remember that joy does matter for caregiver health. So that concludes my talk. This is my contact information, and I will pass it on back to you, Mr. Michael. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Dr. Croff, thank you both for your time and for an exciting presentation. You covered a lot, and it was some pretty impressive things there. I particularly took joy in your desire to go through this and also reduce stress at the same time. And also just the ability to slow the rate of decline for those attending live performances. I myself went to an art school, so I love that you're advocating for that and hope that people take joy and pleasure in that. We do have a few minutes for a few Q&As. So I've got these coming from a few different places, so you may see me looking at 2 different screens here. The first question how often should you walk to get the benefits for improving your brain? So I think that may be in relation to the cognitive study that you talked about. And then I have a follow-up question once you're finished with that.
Well, the good news is even low intensity walking, like that one study showed that anywhere from, so low intensity is 0 to 100 steps per, I want to say per minute. Maybe that's not right, but the point is low intensity walking, even that has cognitive effects. The thing is you need to do it regularly. So a little bit of walking every day. Now, if you can do a more intense walk, maybe 3 times a week, which is what we did for the SHARP study, that did show those cognitive benefits. And so I didn't mention, but the walks in the SHARP study were only a mile. And so when you're walking and talking, that takes about 45 minutes to an hour if you really want to kind of slow down and be social. And what's good about walking with others is if you walk fast, you get that physical benefit. If you walk slower and you talk, well, you're still getting the cognitive benefit from socializing.
Awesome, thank you. And for folks that are interested, how would one go about joining the SHARP Seattle program?
I thought somebody might ask that. So this was, so we've just completed our first pilot. And so what a pilot means is that now we need to review the data and see if it worked for people in Seattle, if they enjoyed it, and what sort of changes we need to make, including to the technology. So there is not going to be a second round of walks right away, though I do hope that the city of Seattle will fund us once again, or we'll find other funding and we'll be able to restart the program in the future. And when that program is available, I'm sure Ms. Karen Winston and ADS will get that information out to everybody. But at the very least, I'm hoping that we can at least get the walking routes available to the public so that they can do those walks on their own or with a friend, even if they're not officially enrolled in the SHARP Seattle program.
Awesome. And we, of course, are more than happy to help get that information out to folks. Here's a follow-up question. What if you can't get out? What can you do in your home to keep moving?
Great question. Again, that has to do with the fact that even low intensity movement throughout the day had cognitive effects, but you got to move a little bit every day. So there are wonderful exercises you can do on your chair. You can even like cooking, making sure you're kind of moving around the kitchen. I had a slide in here earlier about music, but I just didn't have time to present that. Have some music on, see what happens. See if something starts moving because you got the music on. And it could just be light, easy, gentle movements. But the point is you got to keep moving, and you don't necessarily have to go outside to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for taking the time to join us. I see that a few folks have requested your email, so you might get some follow-up questions, but that concludes our Q&A here. And as we transition, we will take a quick stretch break as we prepare for our caregiver panel. So during the break, feel free to review the upcoming slides as it relates to the caregiver resources.
The half grandchild is the one that my oldest daughter's child, and she always wanted to live with me. So the 2 children that I raised from birth were my youngest daughter's grandchildren, a son and a daughter, who are now all grown up and have children, and so does a half grandchild. So the half grandchild would live with me when she was upset with her parents, and then when she got not being upset with her parents, she'd come back. So my kinship journey began as my daughter got on crack, the crack generation and how things were for crack. So my daughter lived next door to a neighbor, and she left her oldest child next door with the man to go pay her light bill. And this has been about 20 years later, and she still hasn't paid that light bill. My second grandchild that I raised from birth was born during his mother's journey. She was smoking crack that morning and went to the hospital. He was born a month early. Mm-hmm. So those were 2 children that I had. I had a newborn baby that the state wanted to take, and my coworker said, you know, how are you going to do it? And I was working full time for the city of Seattle, and I said, I can't teach my children's morals and standards with someone else raising them, so I have to be able to take care of my grandchildren myself. So that was very different, because every morning I would leave home at 10 minutes to 7, get home after they had grown up at 9:15 in the evenings, and I had to learn how to use the crock pot, and I don't use the crock pot now anymore, because I had to make sure the kids had something to eat. And I haven't had spaghetti but once in about 5 years, because we got enough of spaghetti and mac and cheese. My grandchildren are normal grandchildren. My oldest granddaughter, one is business minded. She now works for the UW as, I don't know, has something to do with the mental health people. And the next one was a sports fanatic. He only played basketball, football, ran track. And, you know, sometimes he would be at home to really eat like dinner time come. So we had a different one, and the half grandchild played basketball. And they all went to two different schools. The thing is, as a kinship caregiver, it's so different to let people know that this is a lot of different in kinship care and foster care, and everybody want to think this foster care. But during all this journey, the things that happened to me, and I tried to remain social and to really stay into whatever's going on, was I was working full time. And during that time, I attend church. That's my only outlet, was going to church. So during that time, as I would go to church and I sang in the church choir, I got to be nominated president of the church choir. Oh, so many different things that I did, and I don't know how I would have done it. But then one of the things that really helped me more than anything else was becoming the first kinship navigator for King County. And that meant that there was a new program, that it was a pilot program that no one has ever done before. So I had to help to get the rules and the regulations and get to know the different agencies. And I'm really proud of that. That was one of the accomplishments that I made, along with raising my grandchildren. And then in the middle of that, the people at church came to me and said, let's do something for kinship. I started a kinship care support group for kinship caregivers for the grandparents that were raising children other than their grandchildren. During that time, it really became apparent that it's a journey of love. It's not a journey where you really have to, it's not in the book. And then I got another job. I retired from the city of Seattle for the first time. And I started to work for Casey Family Programs, and they took me all over the United States, and I probably would have gone somewhere else, but I refused to. And I learned so much that there is a generation of lost people, a whole people that are lost that nobody really know about. They pretend they do, but nobody know. The caregiving for children is, you got the diarrhea, you got the ear infections, and you got everything.
So
you got everything.
Excuse me, Ms. Sawyer, can I ask you to give us some advice for others, given the experience that you had? Can you give us some advice?
With the kinship caregivers, the one thing that you have to do is associate. You have to really forget your social life as you once knew it. Your social life totally changes because people are going on to dinner and everything and doing different things that socially you did before, but you can't take the children. So the one thing that I really suggest is that you have to get your own group of friends. It's a whole new thing of getting friends that really participate in the same thing that you do. Well, that's kinship. Then come the caregiver. The caregiver. My sister, I was a caregiver for my sister who had dementia. She never did get to the point to where she had Alzheimer's, but it was dementia, and so many different things happened. And I had to learn how to reach agencies that would really help us to give resources and whatever to be done for her in order to keep her safe. She was military retired. Her husband was a military retired. So she had lived at Fort Lewis, and she had lived in Grenada. She had lived all over the world. and she was director of nursing at one of the hospitals in Germany, and all kind of things. And caring for a senior is different from caring for a child.
Mhm.
A child will want one thing that you can do to satisfy them, but then that senior, there are certain things that are required. But with my sister, she always had to have graham crackers and peanut butter.
Okay.
So we
Okay.
always had to have that. But the real help that you get comes from word of mouth, because very seldomly you're in a group where someone has not experienced what you've experienced. So you have to really make sure that you get with a group of people that can give you positive advice.
And on that note, Ms. Sawyer, we're going to have to move on to our other two panelists that we have today.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate you sharing that, because we never get to hear the part of being a kinship person, taking care of other children, and also taking care of an elder. Thank you so much for your time. We need to move on now to Wilhelmina, Associate Minister Wilhelmina Daniels. Wilhelmina is the Director of Goodwill Development and retired state licensed commercial insurance agent and broker. She's an associate minister at Tabernacle Church, and she's the second oldest child of Armida Wright. And that was her mother, her loving mother. And she spent her last year being the caregiver for her mother. So, Wilhelmina, could you please tell us more at this time? Hello?
Okay, good afternoon. Yes, I cared for my mom. At the point of my being an insurance agent and international broker, it came to a point where my mom needed to move out from the Cannon house where we had her. And so I quit my job, and well, the five of us kids came together, and I was the one chosen to have this great experience of taking care of my mom. My mom was born in Brunswick County, Virginia, on a farm. She was oldest of 16 children, and she had to help take care of all those children. So at some point in her life, she said, "I'm tired of this." She quit school at the 8th grade. And at that time in Virginia, people would go up to Boston to, their girls would go up to Boston and work and send money back down south to the farm. And so and we had relatives in Boston then. And so my mom had been married to a person, in my father was in the Army, but he was from Massachusetts. And so they eventually, when he came back from the war, they went to live in Massachusetts, where I was born. So she was a person that was very independent. She wanted to do everything on her own. And so we had a time with her. And so eventually when we had to get her to the Cannon house, it was a 2-week interval where we had to wait to get her in there. And so the family came together, her children and her grandchildren. We all came together, and we took time, like we had so many hours that we would stay with her. One would stay like maybe 8 hours during the day, and one in the afternoon, and then somebody overnight. So we had to be there 24/7 with her before we took her to the Cannon house. But we all came together as a family. My brothers came out from Boston to help take all of her belongings out of the apartment that she was in. And when she got to the Cannon house, she enjoyed being there, and she always tried to run everything. But she started walking around at night looking for her medication. And then she would tell us, "Oh, they're not giving me my medication." Well, we found out she was going at 3 o'clock in the morning, going to the nurse's station, looking for her medication. But we had to go through a process to figure that out. And so, so that's the time when we decided that we would have her come live with me. And she was a person, like she had dropped out of school in 8th grade, but in her elder years, she started reading books, law books and health and medical books. And when I had her at my house, she said, you know, it's not good to move older people from where they are. So she was still trying to run things. But the one thing that we had that was good for me was that I still worked part-time at the Goodwill Development Association. And so I had a little time to be away from home. And also my sister would be there to assist if I didn't get home on time or whatever. She would she could come. She was close enough to come and sit in with my mom until I got there. So I had a backup. And another agency that helped us was the Providence Elder Care. And once a week they would take her, pick her up on the bus and take her to their facility on Martin Luther King. And so they had doctors and nurses on staff there to check on her physically. And so I didn't have to make doctor appointments to, you know, unless it was something she had to go to a hospital for. But so that was really helpful that she could spend a day there. And then they also had.
So Wilhelmina,
Yes.
what kind of advice would you give us as a caregiver at this point? What would you?
I would say to make sure that you have your respite time. We had a time that we found a facility that would take my mom for a weekend so that we would have a really good break. And so that's a definite thing you have to do, is have something for yourself to do. And then know that your mom, you're the person you're taking care of is safe.
Okay. Thank you so much, Wilhelmina, for your time. And we'll look forward to, we're going to have some question and answers after we have our last person, which is going to be Michelle Williams. Michelle Williams is a retired Boeing manager. She was over a great deal of people, managed a lot of good folks, and she had 4 siblings, and she was the elected person in her family that back in 2017 decided to move her mother into her home and spend the duration of her mother's life. Michelle, would you like to tell us more about your journey with your mom?
Yes, I would sure love to. I put together a little quick slide of who my mama is. My mama, her name is Georgia Louise Williams. My mother was born and raised in Selma, Alabama. Both of my parents were. She met my dad. They got married at 17. She was 17, he was 19. He joined the Army, and their journey around the world began with military life. And to that union, there was 4 children born. You know, my mother became a military wife. She went to college, worked at various companies, and she finally retired in 1998. But by that time, my parents had divorced when I was age 16. One of the things about my mother did not know how funny she was. My mother really should have probably been a comedian. You know, she would say stuff off the wall, and she was from the Deep South. So there was always sayings that she would say that I find myself today actually saying. So one of the things too is like my dad, when my parents divorced, my dad, maintained his military career. He retired. He was a Special Forces Green Beret, and he ended up settling in Kansas, and he ended up getting sick. So we moved him up here to Tacoma, Washington, where my mother was. And my dad was on dialysis 3 times a week and had a lot of his other illnesses too. So we were doing caregiving for my dad prior to providing caregiving for my mom, because when my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, we weren't aware of how far it had already advanced. And so one of the things is she had a fall back in October of 2017 and was found unconscious by my younger brother and was taken to St. Joe's. And she stayed in the hospital for about 2 months. Oh, wow. And she ended up going into a rehab place. And while she was at the rehab place, My dad's condo caught on fire. He had a massive heart attack, couldn't get out the door because he had a stick in the slider. And so he suffered from a heart attack and smoke inhalation, and he ended up passing away. The day of my dad's service, my sister went to pick up my mother to bring her to the service, and we found that the rehab place she was staying had over-medicated my mother. And so we were not able to bring her to the service. At that point, we took her to the hospital, and she ended up staying in the hospital for about 4 months, because we had to come up with a plan to provide 24-hour care because they wouldn't release her until then. She was released to her home in Tacoma, Washington. I have an older brother, there's 4 of us. And my older brother said, oh, okay, I will stay at the house with mom and take care of her. So we were like, oh, okay, cool. He had been somewhat estranged from the family. And I'm gonna emphasize how important family support is for caring for your parents or any of your loved ones. So actually, my mother was discharged from the hospital in April of 2018. One day in June, my brother left and never came back. Left my mom.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so I'm just being real transparent about this. And so my sister, my younger brother, and I had to figure out a plan on how we're going to do this. I had a friend, my best friend from high school, actually happened to be a caregiver, and she stepped in and said, hey, I'll help you guys and do what you need to do. So she was there taking care of my mother until I was able to coordinate caregiving services with, you can go to with caregiving services with some home care agencies, because my mother required 24-hour care. Her memory loss was, her memory was deteriorating. It was diminishing pretty quickly. She was bedridden because she refused physical therapy while she was in the hospital. And the hospital, not understanding that, she didn't make that decision to have it or not. And so she stopped walking all of a sudden. Plus, on top of that, she had rheumatoid arthritis. And so she required assistance for, everything, for feeding, bathing, medications, everything. And so that's, so the next thing that I did was, before we could even have her released from the hospital, we had to, coordinate home care services. So I was still working. I had to be to work at 5 o'clock, and it got to be too much. So with my sister, my brother, and I going back and forth to Tacoma to stay with my mother during the evening. So we made the decision that my mother would be moving in with me. So I was able to coordinate home care through agencies like the Korean Women's Association, A&B Home Care. But I went through a series of like 14 different caregivers throughout this 3-year period of time that my mother lived with me. I mean, it's very difficult and challenging to get a good caregiver, but my best friend from high school, she stuck with me the whole entire 3 years that my mother lived with me. So that was a blessing.
So Michelle, can you give us some advice?
I can give you a lot of advice. One of the things about listen attentively to your parents, to your care, because even though she may not have all her faculties, you've got to listen to them, and you've got to really exercise patience, especially when dealing with Alzheimer's patients. And you've got to have a plan. You've got to have a plan on what to do. You've got to have a plan on, who's going to be there to support you, who's going to, be there to manage all the medical appointments, the medications that's required, in the finances, and ask for help. You got to definitely ask for help and pray for them, pray with them, and you really got to take care of you, because if I talk real quickly, I end up, trying to do a lot of stuff on my own. I end up hurting my back trying to move my mother, and I end up having to have back surgery at one point in time.
Wow. Oh.
But yeah, but I was blessed to be able to retire in 2020. And so I was blessed to be able to spend the last year of my mother's life with her completely. And she just transitioned. It's been a little over a year, October 18th, 2021. So there's a lot.
So in that last year, did you have caregivers with you as well?
I did. I would have,
okay.
yeah, my last year, I still had we still would have my best friend would come in the morning just so that I can have some respite. I needed, some time.
Right.
But there were times when I would have to leave work when I was working to come home because the caregivers that from the agencies would not show up. But thank God I had a very supportive director. He would allow me to come home and I would work from home and take care of my mother. And then my brother and sister, they rotated coming during the evening to help support. Like my brother would come 4 days a week and my sister would come 3 days a week, and she would spend every Friday night with him, with me and my mom. And then my mom's last month of life, my brother and my sister, they moved in here with me full time to take care of my mother. So we were here from the beginning to the end.
That's a
My mother
blessing.
did,
That's really
that was a blessing. So, and one of the things that I wanted to point out too, as a caregiver, one of the things that I found that really helped our family is I installed a camera in my mother's room so that everybody in the family had access and they could look at that camera 24/7 just to see what was going on with my mother, and the caregivers, and even my mother's sister who lives in Selma, Alabama, she had access, so she could view to see what her sister was doing and would call and say, "Hey, you might want to go in the room because my sister's doing whatever." But so that was that really helped. I even had with my neighbors even helped, even with like the bed, the hospital bed would break. The service that we rented it from would come at 9 o'clock. My mom would be asleep at 7 o'clock. But my neighbor across the street, he was a jack of all trades. He would come over and fix stuff, fix the bed, fix the, everything that needed to be fixed. My neighbors were very supportive. It's really, the support is one of the biggest things that you need, even though you do need that time. But I just was, I would do it all over again because that's my mom. And I love my mom.
I hear you. I hear you
so much. But my life changed dramatically in those last 3 years. Because I seldom had time for just me, but there were times when I just had to step away and make that time.
That's right. You got to take care of yourself.
Yeah,
I can't
and just
tell
a lot of
you how
prayer.
much. I can't tell you how all three of you have. Your stories are amazing. Every year we get such amazing. No two stories are the same. Everything is different. We always get new information, and I just can't tell you. It's just been wonderful. We're now going to have a Q&A, question and answers for people to put information and ask questions in the chat to be able to ask the panelists as well as Dr. Croff at this time. And I just want to shout out and say to Michelle, I have cameras in my house as well. So I know about that whole process with my mom.
That's right.
Okay, so moving it along now to the Q&A. And I think, Michael, you're going to run that. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, I am here in the background to support. So we've got a few questions that have come in so far. Let's see here. I know someone who recently became a caregiver for her 2 grandkids. She needs support. What resources would you recommend for her, and where can she find financial support?
Wow. Does any of the panelists want to answer that question?
I believe King County had a kinship funding. I was dealing with legislation, and we found that they had funds for just everyday things, like if a person needed diapers or tires for their car, just those basic things that you wouldn't think that you could get funds for. So I think there's a kinship program still going on.
Does anybody else have anything? You can also check with your local senior centers. They have availability. Check with their social workers, I would recommend. And also, again, checking with aging and disability is who you can call, and they will take you. As Mary Mitchell mentioned in the beginning, call Connections, and they will take you straight away, say you're a caregiver, and they will help. Okay.
For the state of Washington, there is a kinship caregivers program that is run by the kinship navigators, and navigators or persons that are able to direct you to any agency for any kind of resources that are needed. Catholic Community Services is a contact person for this area for King County, and King County has where they give clothing, monies for clothing for children that are, once you become a kinship caregiver and your child don't have any clothes, then you just contact Catholic Community Services and they will be able to help you. There's money for school supplies. There's money for schools, for computers and all kind of things that are really needed in order to try to make the families whole. And Catholic Community Services is the one that I would really, contact, because they have all of the resources for all the state of Washington.
Okay. Is there another question? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, we've got one more question, and it's similar to what we just asked, so feel free to re-elevate some previous answers. What are some of the names of the agencies that you've used in the past? This particular person is looking for help for their mother. So let's see here. She's in the same situation as your mother, as she did not have any family support. So I think just resources, here again, I see a few in the chat here. I think we'll probably send out a list, but if there's any resources that we haven't named yet, want to invite folks to call that out.
I just want to mention that Catholic Community Services has an African American Elders Program. And so that needs to be, that's another contact, direct contact. Sina Washington and Mary Bodie that are on this planning committee are the folks that are involved in that. So please give them a call. They actually have case managers that actually come out to the homes. And so that's a definite resource there. So other than what we said, excuse me.
I wanted to say that Providence Elder Care, they have contacts to independent caregiver services.
Mm-hmm.
The best resource that you can get is word of mouth. That is where someone has really had something that they need help, assistance with, and there's always someone available to help you. And one thing to remember is everything that is done, all resources that are given, is a professional, confidential information. You can't, if my child and your child are related and you don't know it or something, there's a way that we have to really allow it to be professional, how you answer questions, and let it be confidential, because so often we don't get resources because we are afraid of confidence, somebody talking about us. And you know how we are, we're going in my house, stay in my house. Sometimes.
Yeah, and I also just saw something in the chat that is that every year that Tukwila has a caregiver conference that people can attend, and it's widely attended. So that's another. There's a lots of different resources. If you call Living Connections, you can find out. And if you tap into any other resources with the senior centers or African American elders or aging and disability, you can find a place for help. And of course, you can use us as a resource as well, since we've all are living in the caregiver world.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Croft, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Croft at all?
I've got one unofficial question, and this is for Dr. Croft and each of the panelists. In 60 seconds or less, what's one thing you want people to take away from today's program? And we'll start with Dr. Croft, and then we'll make our way through the panel.
Okay.
Well, somebody else here said planning, make sure you have a care plan, because you need a care plan in order to have respite for yourself, in order to do all that joyful stuff I was talking about. So that's what I would say. I would say, take that time to make a plan, reach out to the resources that have been mentioned here if you need assistance for that plan, and then make that time for that self-care.
I just wanted to say, if you reach out to your family, because you may not realize how they will want to help in the situation. The granddaughters, the great granddaughters, they were all right there, when we did the 24/7. And then the one thing, my one granddaughter, we tried to keep her mouth from smoking, but she was one that would sneak the cigarettes in. And so it was there was a time, so they get their best buddies, so you have to kind of monitor them sometimes, but family members will come together and help out.
The one thing I'd like to say is that once you become a caregiver, generational, or whatever, whichever role that you play, that don't forget that you are important. So you can't lose yourself in taking care of others. So remember that you're important. My takeaway used to be, when I was working, I would get a cup of coffee and I would go out on Rainier Avenue in Renton and watch the planes from Boeing. I didn't answer the phone. It didn't matter what happened. If anything happened that you can't handle in 60 seconds, it's okay. You can take care of it later. So remember, you're the most important person to be taken care of. Always take time for you. Don't get lost taking care of them.
Okay, so I was the one that said, have a plan, ask for help, from family, friends, neighbors. Be an advocate for your family member, be it for medical reasons, be an advocate, and most importantly, take care of you. Take care of you. This situation with my mother happened during the pandemic. I was part of a gym. I ended up buying a shed and building a home gym in my backyard. So that was one of my escapes where I could work out and clear my mind and exercise. So it's very important to take care of you, because that's one of the things that caregivers do, is they neglect themselves. And if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anybody else.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, Michael, you want to wrap this up? I think do any other questions?
I don't see any other questions. I do see a request to save the chat, so we'll certainly work to collect the information shared here and share that back out with folks. But just to kind of repeat what we heard a request that folks make a plan for respite, work with your family members and collaborate. Remember that you too are important, and to reclaim your time as necessary, but also to be an advocate for everybody involved. So just want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank Dr. Croff. I want to thank Sharon for being an amazing facilitator. And with that being said, I think we can transition into our final segment. So thank you again. We appreciate you.
Okay.
All right. So in our final segment, we'll hear from Pastor Catherine Cordova, who will improve and revise our understanding of the end-of-life process, hospice services, and other important considerations. Pastor Cordova is chaplain for Evergreen Hospice Services in Kirkland, Washington. In addition to her divinity training, she holds a master's degree in human service counseling and has taken the initiative to continue her education by pursuing a doctoral degree. As a doctoral candidate, Pastor Cordova is pursuing a degree in ministry and global evangelism. The pastor is certified by the state of Washington to work as a certified instructor and anger management specialist. I'm also told that the pastor has a loving and large family. She is mother to 16 amazing children, 3 by birth and 13 by adoption, marriage, and/or foster care. She also has 33 loving grandchildren, plus 1 on the way, and 3 great grandchildren. So, Pastor, thank you for your time, your commitment to others, and your commitment to family, both internal and external. We look forward to learning more about the end-of-life issues and services from you. Pastor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say what an honor to be a part of this group. This subject is so important, getting information out to our caregivers, to those that love our loved ones, and being strong, helping build each other up. As mentioned, I am a chaplain. I'm a hospice chaplain and a pastor at a church in Kent. And so demystifying conversations around the end of life is really important to me. It has been for a very long time. And it is difficult. It is a taboo subject oftentimes in the African American community. Death itself or end of life issues itself can be taboo. And there are many elements that that are the reason why it's taboo. One of them being religious, another cultural or historical reasons. And so we're just going to talk a little bit about why is it such a taboo to talk about end-of-life issues for African Americans. We'll start with the religious perspective. In Romans 14, or Romans 4:17, I should say, it talks about speaking what is not as if it is. We don't even want to talk about end-of-life issues. We don't want to talk about death and end of life, what it might mean. Oftentimes I hear African Americans in my family and in my surroundings talk about they're afraid it will bring death on if death is talked about. Proverbs 18:21 talks about life and death is in the power of the tongue. And again, we don't want to bring about something that we don't want to happen. We have all kinds of mystic perspectives of what death is and what it represents. Scripture consistently talks about thinking about what's pure and lovely and meditating on good things. But really the truth is that God talks about in 1 Timothy 5:8, he talks about religiously caring for our family. And if we're not caring for our family, it's as if we've left our faith. But care in the African American perspective, really because of a historical perspective, has been morphed. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first, I want to really talk, in essence, at the end of the religious perspective is we are afraid when it comes to end-of-life issues, programs like Death with Dignity. We're concerned that when we talk about end of life, when we talk about maybe even people looking for assistance in dying, that we are committing the ultimate sin, the sin that is unforgivable. But Matthew 12, really the full chapter, but Matthew 12 starts off with Christ walking through a field with corn, and it's on the Sabbath, and the disciples are picking corn and eating it, which was really against the rules. It was against the rules to work for your food. You were supposed to prepare your food the night before. And so the legalistic people, the Pharisees, said, hey, what are you doing? You're sinning. You're doing wrong. And this starts a discussion, or many discussions, of Jesus saying, you're missing it. Don't you know that even David, when he was hungry and he had his troops, came into the house of God and ate the table of showbread, which was really for the priests. They weren't even supposed to be there. But what you're missing, Christ essentially says, is you're missing. It's not sacrifice I want, it's mercy. It's loving one another. You're missing the point when it's the letter of the law that kills. It's the spirit gives life. And so I just wanted to talk about that initially, that oftentimes in the African American community, we have so many layers of issues why end of life is taboo. One of the panelists said something that's very common for us. What happens in the house stays in the house. What goes on in the house stays in the house. And so we're concerned about others finding out, others' opinions, others' attitude, and we hide, we separate. And that separation and that isolation cuts us off from community, it cuts us off from resources, it cuts us off from having a healthy conversation that can help us actually progress into the place we are, which is a better place than we began at. And I want to talk a little bit about that historical perspective, which morphed into a cultural perspective. So we've looked at the religious taboos that often are held within the African American community. And now the cultural or the historic perspective that we have that created also taboos in talking about end of life perspective were valid. They were very valid things. There is something called adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive is simply when we get to a point where we make changes to suit our situation. There's a situation that's at hand. We need to adapt to it to make it workable for our situation. So we adapt. Human nature is to adapt. Well, that's great in certain circumstances, and we're supposed to adapt. And that's what we did historically. And I'll get to that. Historically, we had situations where African Americans did not have access to healthcare. We did not have access to hospitals. We did not have access to good counsel. And so because of those reasons, we adapted. We did what we needed to do. We saw the situation, it was unmanageable to be able to, if we had a relative or a loved one that needed care, we couldn't simply go to the hospital. We couldn't simply go get healthcare or workers. We had to do it within the family, and there was no question about that. And it was correct for the time. Now, we are at a place in our culture, in our history, where that is not the only decision that's there to be made. And so when we use those very relative, very significant adaptations that were needed back in history, and we superimpose them on today's access that we have to healthcare and medical care and insurance and programs, that same perspective becomes maladaptive. And maladaptive just means that we're not providing adequate adjustment to the environment. We are using old information to make new decisions. And we need to start making new decisions based on the new information that we have, and go from the maladaptive back to where we started, which was an adaptive perspective. So I want to give just a little breakdown on our history. African Americans didn't have access to medical care, especially right after the Civil War. There were, in fact, doctors, African American doctors, after the Civil War. Not all of America was in slavery. There were free areas of the United States, and there were Black doctors and Black nurses and Black healthcare workers. The issue was there wasn't access to hospitals. Most hospitals not only would not allow educated medical care workers in the hospital, but they would not let patients, African American patients, in. And that basically created what we talked about. There was a need to adapt to that. There was a need of medical care. It wasn't there. So we had to do the best we could within the confines of our reality. Historically, what happened was there was a freedman hospital established, and it was established actually on the grounds of Howard University. And it was established through the Freedmen's Bureau in order to deal with slaves or those coming out of slavery, African Americans who needed medical care, but they did not have access to medical care. And so a group of doctors and medical people got together with the government and said, hey, we're going to have to deal with this issue because we don't have access and we need access. We were really transitioning at that time from being totally excluded from healthcare and the provision that healthcare gives, moving into a kind of a segregation where we do have access, but it's separate. And that was important at the time. And that adjustment, eventually what it did, and that happened back in the 1800s, where those facilities were started to become managed. In 1862, actually, is when the first Freedman Hospital was created in Washington, D.C., 1862. Through 1862 to the 70s, actually, or to the 60s, I should say, was the movement, the hospital movement, where African Americans and the government got together and said, you know, we need to create more access. We are not able to treat and care for the African American community as we should. And so we needed to build those facilities and make accessible treatments. The reality is that if care was to happen during those times, during the 1800s and prior, it was to happen within the household. And that was the only option. Even the hospitals that were built, and there were some 90 hospitals that came from that movement. It was incredibly successful movement. However, most of those hospitals were in large cities, and most of the African American community did not live in large cities. And so we still had a lack. We still had a need that wasn't being met. And how are we going to meet it? Basically, we adapted, and love, or our definition of love, became synonymous with providing healthcare for our loved ones, because that is what love was. There wasn't access any other way. So if we loved our parents, if we loved our relatives, we provided healthcare for them, whether we were equipped or not. And that was a great adaptive move to the circumstance. There was also the issue of mistrust. Our culture gave reason to, or the American culture as a whole gave reason to the African Americans to have mistrust about healthcare. We are familiar with the Tuskegee study, where over 400 African Americans in Alabama were studied with syphilis and not told they had syphilis and not treated for their syphilis. And that study was conducted by our government. And that study started in 1932, and it actually went to 1972. And so if you think about the range of years where we had healthcare and government agencies aware that there was sickness in the Black community, and instead of treating it, which there were treatments at the time, they just watched. So we have the religious perspective of taboo, why we don't want to talk about healthcare or end-of-life services for African Americans. Then we have the culture of mistrust, and we rightly were suspicious and are suspicious of healthcare at times, because this is 1972. It's not all of us were alive during that are on this panel were alive in 1972, and this study was still going on. So you have those two layers of why it's taboo to talk about and deal with end-of-life issues. Well, let's look at what that practically meant in the African American community. My family personally, I'm blessed to have connection with my family through slavery. So my great-grandmother, who died in 94, she actually was 99 years old. Her mother was a slave. She died in 1994, and her mother was a slave. So I heard the stories about slave time firsthand from my grandmother, my great-grandmother. I heard about when she was born, how she worked at the house that her mother was enslaved at, taking in laundry and doing daycare. This was something that wasn't in history books. This actually happened in my family. And so having the practical communication of what that looked like, what all this historical view of need for adaptivity to our situation, what it looked like in our family was amazing. During her time, in my mother's time, in my grandmother's time, my family grew up in Palestine, Texas. And in Palestine, you were not, as an African American, allowed to go to the hospital. Still, my mother was born in 1940. She's alive. She's here with me. She's 83 years old. When she was born, she was not allowed to, her mother was not allowed to give birth in a hospital. So midwives came by. Midwives came by and serviced all the counties in Texas for those that were African Americans. And about twice a year, the midwives would go into the county records department and turn in the records for childbirth. The people that got those records, everybody that was listed on that record, every child got the same birthday, because that's when they were registered. What that meant was, when my mother, even though my grandfather was in career military and they traveled the world with the military, once she was disconnected from the military, my grandfather retired, she was not legally able to get a passport because her birth certificate was not actually correct. It was a falsified birth certificate based on the circumstances. So I say all of that to help us understand there is a history, a relative real history of why we have taboos set up in our mind about why it's not okay to go to hospitals to deal with end-of-life issues. And they're real, and we need to acknowledge them. I know we're running out of time, and I'll quickly finish this up. The important thing here is to get to a point where we start to reframe end-of-life issues in this discussion. Love is still providing care, but it no longer has to be done with a non-qualified the ranks of our family. It's not just up to us anymore. We're not in that situation where we can't legally go to hospitals, or we can't legally get good health care. And we've talked about some of that. The panelists have shared the way they've reached out and looked for aid and looked for help and resources pooling. And that's part of what we have access to now. But we also have access to something called hospice. Hospice is basically when the medical field has come to the end of their resources. They have tried everything they can and they're no longer able to access health care that will elongate life. It no longer becomes about quantity of life because they've come to the end of their ability to make our relatives healthy anymore. And it then converts to quality of life. And what hospice does is it steps in and says, now that the doctors can't cure, what are we really talking about? It's going from the driver's seat of our relative's healthcare to sitting next to our relative in the back seat saying, this is a season in your life that we all will go through. I'm going to sit with you and be with you in this season and make sure this process is the best process it can possibly be. So we sit next to in hospice and we say, okay, how do we now, since we're not talking about a curative option, but rather a quality of life option, what do we have access to? Well, hospice, first of all, we qualify for hospice, if our loved one qualifies for hospice, it's free. We all of a sudden have access to medicine to help with pain, to help with anxiety. We have access to, one of the panelists talked about having a bed, renting a bed from a company. Well, hospice provides beds and all kinds, oxygen and other tools, walkers, whatever helps the quality of life of that patient who no longer is talking about quantity of years, but quality of years. Hospice, in order to be qualified, means that the doctors say, not only have we come to the end of ability to make you better, but within 6 months, most likely, if all things are the same, you're probably not going to live past that point. And so what I want simply for us to keep in perspective as being understanding that I'm running out of time, or I've run out of time actually, is that hospice is a change in mindset. There was a need for us to be diligent and care for our loved ones alone at home without resources, because it was the environment. The environment now, when it comes to end of life discussion, we don't have to do it alone. Hospice not only provides doctors, nurses, social workers, also chaplains and caretakers that will come in a couple of times a week and bathe your loved one. They will help clothe your loved one. They will help bring in all kinds of adaptive equipment to help position your loved one. Maybe your mom has problems sitting up and can't breathe very well. Well, that hospital bed that it's free through hospice can help lift mom up and maybe provide oxygen free of charge. There's all kinds of dialogue. And what that ends up doing, as I end, is that changes our perspective, and it puts us as African Americans in a place where the end of life is not a crisis any longer. It then becomes an ability to sup and sit next to, walk alongside our loved one. We then have time, now that mom's not in pain because there's medication, now that mom can breathe because there's a bed and there's oxygen that's provided. Now we have time to say, well, mom, what happened as a child? Let me write it down. Tell me my lineage. Tell me your hopes and dreams. We get to start to have a dialogue and enjoy this last season with our relative rather than having it be crisis. The social worker will come in and provide help to help us do end of life planning, funeral planning, this sort of thing. So it's important that we have the whole holistic picture. There was a reason that we needed to care for our relatives by ourselves. It was absolutely necessary. We have now come to a season in our culture, in our history, where it's an option. It's not the only answer. And so getting to a point that we understand that we can incorporate the technology, the resources to be able to say, hey, there are other options here. We're not stuck with what we had. We are significant. That's the main thing. We are significant. We're no longer second-class citizens. We are worthy of health care, and it's no longer required that we provide health care for our relatives, only that we research and choose the best fit for our families. Let's reframe the way we look at healthcare and end-of-life issues so that we can enjoy every season of our lives and not have crisis be present when we could have quality present instead. Thank you.
All right. Well, Pastor, we sincerely appreciate you. And this is some incredible and valuable information. And as we just learned from our presenter, it's not only important to live well, but to plan the best end-of-life experience possible, not just for our loved ones, but for ourselves as well. And thank you again. We have time for a quick 60-second question and answer before we end with a few closing remarks. We recognize that this topic is somewhat taboo. Pastor, in your recommendation, what's the best way to start the conversation around end-of-life planning with family members?
Well, it's the reframing. It's the having the historical perspective that it's not that we're wrong. It's not that we're wrong that there was reasons for it to be taboo. It's just that those reasons no longer stand. And so starting from that historical perspective and saying now that we are not mandated and forced into this confine of perception of what healthcare means, now we can say with gaining wealth, with gaining perspective in our society, options. I always say that wealth is not money. Wealth is options. Wealth is choice. And so gaining a perspective that now, as we progress in politics and in every other field in America, we also need to progress in our perspective that quality of health, quality of time is wealth. And we want to be healthy and wealthy in everything that we do. So that's what I would suggest, starting there with a historical perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. And folks, you've heard some amazing information today. We started with Dr. Croft and had the opportunity to end with the pastor here. To our panelists, Helen, Wilhelmina, Michelle, and our facilitator, Sharon, thank you for an amazing discussion. To those of you who joined us today, thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to listen in. Please help us as we strive to improve programs like this. And you can do that by providing feedback to the planning committee about today's event. An email will be sent to all participants on Monday, and in that email, you will see a link to a short evaluation. We ask that you please complete the online evaluation as soon as possible. This information will allow us to better serve our caregivers, our partners, and the individuals that we're working to care for. For those of you who are interested in receiving CEUs, please email Karen Winston. That being said, thank you again for joining us today. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you next year. Take care.